Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this series of conversations with eminent Hispanists, and it's my pleasure to welcome today Professor Kamen. Welcome, Professor Kamen. Professor Kamen has had a distinguished academic career in several countries: UK, United States, Spain, and he's an author of vast works on Spain that we will be discussing today. It's very important that throughout this series I've tried to highlight the contribution of major historians to shedding new light on obscure topics of Spanish history, and also challenging stereotypes, cliches, and dispelling myths. And in this aspect, perhaps few have done more dispelling myths about Spanish history than Professor Kamen. But to break the ice in our conversation, let's start with your origins and the reason why you decided to become an expert in Spanish history, because you were born in Rangoon, I won't say the year, but in the final days of the colonial era, I could say. Graduated in history at Oxford. Obviously, this would have been an ideal background for becoming a specialist in the British Empire, but instead it was Imperial Spain that attracted your attention. How was this process?
I can speak to this?
Yes,
Is that alive?
Yes,
yeah?
It's alive, yes.
Okay. In fact, I wasn't at all interested in Spain. The reason is very simple. I'll try to explain in 5 words. When I had done my graduate work at University College, I found out that we went to the same college, as it happens. It's curious. I had a possibility of an interest in Spain, but at that time in Great Britain, not just in England, there were no experts in Spanish history at all. None. When it came to trying to find a supervisor at Oxford to advise me, there was not a single expert in Spanish history before the 19th, 20th century. In the end, therefore, they had to give me Raymond Carr as my advisor. And since Raymond didn't know much about Spain before the 19th century, I didn't benefit very greatly from his superb advice. But there was nobody to advise me at all. In the end, they gave me an advisor on French history, so I started doing some work on French history. My real ambition when I graduated was to study Russian history, which was and still is one of my great interests. In the year that I graduated, I published a book in Russian. I translated the poems of Boris Pasternak, which has been on sale regularly over the past few decades. So I was very interested in Russia. But I've discovered that to study Russia before the 18th century is virtually impossible because they have no archives. And the archives were locked up by the state. And also, to study it correctly, I had to learn also Swedish. Now, there are things I can do in life, but learning Swedish is not one of them. So in the end, I gave up and studied French history. My doctoral thesis was on the War of Succession, the French War of Succession in Spain. And so for that, I went for advice to colleagues in France, because there were no experts in Oxford. Are there still experts in history on Oxford today? But at that time, there were very few. And so that's when I first came into touch with colleagues such as Fernand Braudel and others, Pierre Villard and others, who really advised me how to do my research. So I ended up doing work on French history. And that's how I wrote a book, which eventually got the title of The War of Succession in Spain, because they advised me to study the intervention of France in the affairs of Spain. And I started studying Spain. I discovered nobody had ever studied Spain in this period. And so I got more and more curious about this country which nobody was studying. And so that's how I started my interest. It's a very roundabout way, as you can see.
I can see, yes.
Starting with interest in Russia and ending up in Spain.
Right. Mm-hmm. Now, you were initially deeply influenced by the Annales School of History, but then you decided to, it's interesting that then you focused a lot on writing biographies. Let's talk about this for a while. One of your major biographies was about Philip II of Spain. Now, it's interesting that you seem to give a more human dimension of the figure that has been subject of all sorts of stereotypes and very often not very positive images. Would you really conclude that he deserved to be known as the prudent king?
Philip has suffered actually at the hands of all his biographers in one way or the other. And the problem with studying Philip for me was that when I started the study, I did this when I first started working in Spain, was that I didn't believe in that it would be useful at all. Because my mind was trained to believe that history consists of studying big forces, great movements, the substratum of reality, and not the unimportant gestures which individuals such as prime ministers and kings make to history. And so I was convinced that Philip II was a totally pointless person to study. And with this in mind, I tried to get some material out of the documents, which, by the way, mine was the first full biography of Philip II, and so virtually all the literature that I found, the manuscripts were virgin. And it was very revealing to me. I discovered a Philip whom I didn't think had existed. And indeed, the Philip I created, because remember that you don't always have to believe what historians write. Historians create results from their raw material, and sometimes they differ very widely over their results. And so in the case of Philip, the Philip that I saw through his own writings was someone I didn't expect. And that got me interested in the reality of biography as being a useful discipline. I still think writing biography is pretty useless as a historical exercise. Now, Philip II also believed this. Indeed, on the last page of my biography of Philip of Spain, it's called, I quote Philip as saying, I have been able to achieve very little because who am I and against all the forces that I have to contend with. In other words, he was correct. At the end of his life, he had achieved very little, and he was very aware of this. And I, as his biographer, was also aware of this. Mm-hmm. So it didn't make me lose my faith at all in annal-type history, which is a history of solidities, substratum, realities, as against the history which many other historians like to study, which is biography. Right. I believe that biography is doesn't reveal as much as you might imagine it does.
Yes. And yet you've written a substantial number of biographies. Just to mention another one about great achievers. Philip V of Spain, he seems to be one of your favorite characters because he's been very much associated with authoritarianism, excessive French influence, responsible for the abolition of historic rights in Catalonia and Aragon. And yet, on the other hand, you consider him as the founder of the modern state in Spain.
Philip V I liked.
You like?
I liked. Philip V I liked because, you see, there were no lives well, there was one life, it was awful in Spanish. But apart from that, there were no real proper studies of Philip V because they all wrote him off as being this guy who'd be responsible for a war and had then gone crazy in his later years, and so on and so forth. But after analyzing his personal life and studying his papers, by the way, All the papers of Philip V were deposited in Spain, but they were all in French, which is one good reason why Spanish historians tended not to study his papers. And so all the papers I used for Philip V were virgin papers, and they were very, very fascinating. But among other things, I found out that the guy was really crazy. And this made me very sympathetic to him, because when you have to take charge of a country, or an empire, as in the case of Spain, and find that you can't do it properly, it will drive you crazy. And it drove him crazy. He suffered from a bipolar disorder, which was very sad indeed, and I give the full details in my biography of Philip of Spain. But in the end, you end up admiring the efforts he made to try and live up to his task of ruling Spain. And I think for a man who was basically half mad, he did a very good job.
Right, and
you could say that about many other politicians as well.
Your most recent biography is on Ferdinand of Aragon, Fernando el Católico, who was, of course, he's been portrayed in Spanish history as the great architect of the process of unification of Spain and of so many other things. Would you consider him one of the best kings that Spain ever had?
One of the best kings Spain ever had is the description actually given to to Fernando el Católico by many Spanish historians, above all Aragonese historians, because he was from Aragon.
Yeah, obviously.
But the sad thing about Fernando el Católico is really the historians have not studied him. The reason for this chiefly is, of course, that very little documentation exists about him. Also, it was before the beginning of state documentation, where the central government tends to collect its papers into an archives, and so none of that exists. Also, Fernando el Católico wasn't a very literate person, in the sense that he didn't read. He wrote as little as possible. He conversed with ambassadors from foreign countries through translators, because he didn't understand a word of Latin. Ambassadors like the papal ambassador, the German ambassador, they all gave their speeches before the king in Latin, because they didn't speak French. And so Fernando el Católico left us very little to help us understand what he did and why he did it. The result is that he is still revered in Spanish historiography, because the books about him, and there are many, many books about him, they all have a joint title, Los Reyes Católicos, or Isabel y Fernando, in which 90% of the book is about La Reina Católica and 10% about Fernando. And that may be a just proportion, because we have documentation about Isabel la Católica, but Fernando el Católico, very little. So we know little about him. He did quite a big deal, but most of that also is undocumented. So it's not his fault. It's not his fault. If he has a good reputation, it is because citizens of the Corona de Aragon, mainly Aragonese, try to have created him a good reputation, so that he will go down in history as a great king. He was the only king, wasn't he? Because very soon afterwards, the Austrians, they became Castilian more than Aragonese. So.
Right. It's interesting that he's become very popular as a result of the TV series. Have you?
That is a fate worse than death, to become popular because of a TV series.
Okay,
in other words, I agree with you. But it is putting the fiction before the reality, as you will appreciate. So it would have been much better if there had been a good history book before, and then a good TV series afterwards. But yes, it's true.
Right.
We are in the hands of television producers, unfortunately.
Yes. Well, perhaps in your now that you have plenty of time, perhaps you could become more of an advisor to TV producers and hopefully contribute to this phenomenon.
I'm willing to accept the job, yes.
Anyway, there's not many biographies of the great kings by Spaniards. Is this the reason why many of them have not been treated fairly? Because this is a constant in Spanish history.
Almost certainly, yes. But it's also a question of approach. The question of how to deal with your kings. Really, there have been only two real Spanish kings, and that's Fernando and Isabel. Because before them, they are kings of little areas of Spain, Castilla, Aragon, and so on and so forth, not kings of Spain. Mm-hmm. And after them, we have absentee people like Carlos V, who are kings of Spain only in their spare time. So it's true that the kings of Spain have not been well treated by their own historians, but what I'm trying to say is that's because they really have had very few kings, the Spaniards. And the few kings they've had, they've been throwing out all the time. I don't know how many kings you've expelled. Starting with the 19th century, mm-hmm. Nearly every ruler of Spain after the 19th century was kicked out of Spain. Nearly. Yes. Did any of them die on the throne? I can't remember.
Not to my knowledge.
But nearly all of them were thrown out of the country.
Yes.
Spaniards are basically republicans, not royalists. This is absolutely true. And it's one of the reasons why they have never been in love with their kings or their queens.
And yet the paradox is that Spain has always been a monarchy except for two very brief intervals in history.
That probably explica mucho sobre la historia del país.
Okay, let's leave it there then. Moving to other subjects. Now, the Spanish Empire book, one of your major works, Empire, How Spain Became a World Power. This is really where you probably go further in dispelling myths. Now, one of the it's a fascinating book. At the same time, is thought-provoking and quite provocative in some of its major theses, because you obviously interpret the history of the Spanish Empire from a very, very different vision. First of all, you say that the Spanish Empire was not really Spanish because it was more European and global. Because you say that Spaniards on their own could not have managed.
Do you want to stop there and then we'll
yes.
go on? No, state it in different words, the Spanish Empire is not really Spanish. It's because all of us understand an empire as being created, like Genghis Khan, by conquest. But the Spanish Empire was not created by conquest, as we all know. The European so-called empire in Spain came together through the inheritance of several territories in one person, namely Carlos V. None of it was conquered apart from 2 or 3 little territories. I won't go into detail about those. The continent of America, was that conquered? Here we are in difficult territory, because there are people who maintain that 2,000 Spaniards conquered the whole of the continent of America. And my feeling is that nobody could ever have conquered America, and certainly the Spaniards didn't. America became Spanish through a long process which is obvious to see and follow, that is to say, through elimination of the native population, through occupation of small territories, but conquest, no. So if the Spanish Empire ever existed, it was really in the minds of people who wanted this great thing to have some reality. But did it ever have any reality? And I think it's very difficult to pin some reality on the so-called Spanish Empire. Very difficult. For example, the Spanish Empire in Italy was created almost entirely by Italians. Italian soldiers, Italian armies, Italian generals. I could go on about this. The book is about 800 pages long, so
yes.
I cannot give...
The second quite provocative assertion. It's very much in that line that the Spaniards didn't really control America. They were basically in a few enclaves, but the rest of the territory was totally out of control, which of course is true, but isn't that the case with most European global empires? I mean, after all, the British controlled a quarter of the earth, but they didn't really. I mean, you could argue the same about the British Empire or the French Empire, couldn't you?
No, it's, you're absolutely right, and the book states that clearly also, and I also stated that clearly in articles I wrote on the subject, namely, every statement I made in that book about the Spanish Empire is also true about the British, the Germans, the French, and the Russians. That is to say, an empire is never occupied or conquered in the brutal way that Genghis Khan conquered his. It consists of agreements, of joining together, of alliances, of people saying that, all right, we will accept combination with you in order to protect our own interests. And this is what the Spaniards did in America, what the British did in India. Indeed, when my friend Raymond Carr reviewed my book, he said, in fact, Kamen is saying nothing new in this book, because the British Empire was exactly like this. So, I agree with you. There's nothing strange to maintaining that the Spaniards did not conquer, because they didn't, or that the empire was built up of agreements and alliances rather than being an imposition of control. The Spaniards never really controlled their empire. That I could argue in great detail, but which I won't do tonight.
Now the third, and this is probably the most provocative of all, that will obviously get you into trouble in the Instituto Cervantes. You say that one of the most important legacies, the Spanish language, was not that important. It didn't really get very far until the 19th century.
Yeah.
I will try. I will obviously have a few things to say against this, but
no. One of the great drawbacks was when I investigated this was that we have no statistical information about the use or extent of the Spanish language in the colonial empire before the 19th century. After the 19th century, for the first time, the independent governments of places like Venezuela and so on and so forth began to set up ministries of education, which the Spaniards did not have, and took censuses of their population who spoke the languages, who spoke Spanish or who spoke the Indian languages. And without exception, they came up against the problem that the people of America, say 60%, 70%, 80% of their population did not speak Spanish. And so they set about a program of education in the 19th century, not before, to try and spread the Spanish language. And it's thanks to their work, that is to the people who took over America after the Spaniards, that the Spanish language has become so well ingrained in South America. So much so that even today we have a tendency, most notably, and I've commented on this in another place, by Vargas Llosa, who heads a movement for the abolition of all Indian languages in America and the imposition of the Spanish language as being the only useful method of expanding the cultural achievement of the natives of South America. Now, that is Vargas Llosa's opinion, and it's the opinion of many intelligent people in South America, but it is an opinion based on desesperación. That is to say, how can we get the natives to speak Spanish? In the colonial period, they did not speak Spanish. The language normally spoken in northern Mexico, by the way, was a sort of Spanish which no one could even write, because it was the Spanish equivalent of what the English called pidgin English. It was non-grammatical, it had made no sense, it was used by the Spaniards to communicate with the natives, and the natives wrote it when they could write. So it was a state of chaos, and my argument, in other words, is that Spanish did not expand to the extent that we often imagine in colonial America before the 19th century. Its great period of expansion is after the 19th century, according to at least the literature I have studied and the statistics that I've had access to.
Right, but
would you like to speak on this now?
Yes, just a couple of points, just to challenge you on this. But don't you think that this would not have taken place? The post-colonial elites would not have been so keen on spreading Spanish if Spanish had not become their language. And this was very much the result of what the Spaniards were doing in the colonial period, for example, take into consideration, well, first of all, the fact that you have the emergence of a mixed race population. This is very important to spread the language. Then you have the creation of universities. It's extraordinary in the 16th century. For example, you have the first universities. The first one is in Santo Domingo. I must say that because our friend, the ambassador of Dominican Republic, is here. Then in Lima and Mexico, all this obviously contributed to the spread of Spanish among the elites, the small elites that were there, and this obviously had an impact, a very positive impact later. Without this, there would have been no spread of Spanish in the way it spread eventually in the 19th century. Don't you think so?
I agree.
Right, you agree. Okay, right. So, okay, so I think we've reached an amicable agreement here on this point. We can move into the Inquisition.
Oh dear.
So the Inquisition is another of your
Are you threatening me now?
This is another of your great works. It was published originally in 1965 and critically acclaimed as the most important work on the Inquisition, and very important because it was very provocative and it made us think about the Inquisition from a totally different perspective. Basically, obviously I'm over summarizing here, but basically you say that the Inquisition wasn't that bad. It was probably more systematic than other systems of should we say, repression or persecution for religious reasons. So, what was this must have been created such an impact in historiography when you published this, didn't it?
Yes, apparently it started modern Inquisition studies, because I later on I went to lots of conferences and so on, and yes, it helped Inquisition studies to take off. But the trouble with all of these studies, as you know, as a scholar yourself, is that they all take off in different directions, and sometimes the directions are crazy. So with the Inquisition, which is such a provocative subject, there were always people who are bound to try and study aspects of it which unbalanced the perspective that I was trying to achieve of the Inquisition. With the result is that within a few years after the publication of my book, Inquisition studies took off in wildly different directions. For example, Jewish historians, I mean Israeli historians, plus historians in the United States of America, went off in one direction, insisting that the Inquisition was a concern only of Jewish people, and that they had virtually no impact on other people. Now that tended to distort the studies. Then there were others who felt, because the Inquisition was responsible for deaths and so on, that they could compile statistics about this. And so some young professors got together and compiled statistics, which were so unacceptable that they were very quickly dropped. I mean, nobody quotes them now because those statistics are no longer acceptable. In other words, it provoked a large amount of research and interest, but I'm not sure that it took us any closer to finding an equilibrium, a balance in the way we approach our view of the historical impact, in this case, of the Inquisition on the people of Spain.
Right. But would it be fair to conclude as a result of this research that there was no more religious persecution in Spain than in other parts of Europe in the 16th and 17th century?
Oh yes, much less religious persecution. That is the fact. That is the fact. Hundreds of times, you could multiply by hundreds the amount of people who died in foreign countries as against those who died in Spain as a result of religious persecution, especially in the epoch of the Reformation. For example, a simple figure given, which is more or less correct, is that in the whole lifetime of the Inquisition, over 400 years, it probably was responsible for the execution of maybe about 3,000 people. Whereas we know that on one single night in France in August 1572, 30,000 people were killed between Catholics and Protestants. So, you know, the comparison is, and not to mention the English thing, English kept killing, but later the figures don't appear so often in print. It's true that the Spanish were not so much of a persecuting people at that period or even before. But those who don't wish to accept this, because they don't want excuses to be made for the Inquisition, would say that there were other methods which the Inquisition used in order to oppress people. Namely, it prohibited people from thinking, it prohibited people from reading, it prohibited people from traveling, and so on and so forth. It becomes terribly complex, you know, as soon as you enter into this. With the result that I've recently, last year, published the latest version of my book on the Inquisition, because research has advanced quite a deal, and we are forced to change our conclusions as a result of the way we look at the Inquisition. It's a very rich subject. It still needs a lot of revision, but it will still give rise to these contradictory approaches to how it functioned.
On the other hand, you pose yourself the question of how could this have happened in a society that had once practiced convivencia, the harmonious coexistence of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And isn't this because of another myth, really, that medieval Spain was less tolerant than it was commonly supposed?
Yes, true. But once again, in an attempt to define what the coexistence of different cultures is, we end up looking at a very complex situation. And I find, for practical purposes, and indeed it's one of the approaches I used in this latest version of the Inquisition, for practical purposes, the best way to try and study the way that the cultures had or did not have conflicts in Spain is to compare Spain as closely as possible with the Balkans under Muslim rule, with North Africa under Muslim rule, and with the islands of the Eastern Mediterranean under Muslim rule. And there we'll find that there is a situation which is very similar to that of Spain, in which there's very little persecution, a lot of coexistence, and there is no need to emphasize whether one country is worse than another in its persecution. It is simply that, and I keep emphasizing the word Mediterranean here. I think that those of us who live in the Mediterranean tend to have a more equanimous, I don't know how that is in English even.
Balanced.
A more balanced way of approaching living together. Mainly because of the sunshine, which they don't have so much in England. But I do believe that in a more equable climate, such as the Mediterranean, there is the possibility of a greater coexistence than there is in those darker countries in the north of Europe, like England, Holland, Germany, and so on, where you get the most horrifying persecution, especially during the epoch of the witch persecutions of the 16th and 17th centuries.
Right. Now let's move on to another major topic, a fascinating book you wrote, The Disinherited, Los Desheredados, the exiles who created Spanish culture. This is, I must say, this is probably the book I most enjoyed because it's a fascinating read. The general thesis is that Spain, more than any other Western country, is a nation of exiles. 500 years of expulsion and exodus from Jews, Muslims, to liberals, Republicans, socialists, artists, writers, musicians. And on the one hand, you explain very well how exiles impoverish Spain with their absence and enrich other nations. Obviously, this is what you perceive very well when you read the book, and you notice the sadness of these great figures having to leave Spain. Yeah. On the other hand, this is where you get into more. This is where you get. This is your, I suppose, your provocative angle is when you say that they created a culture of exile. That Spanish culture was very much created through them, but of course. When you see the Golden Age, which was very much the result of people who lived in eminent figures who lived in Spain, or the generations like 1898 generation or 1927 generation, or the Edad de Plata, even Franco in Spain, where you have figures internally like Camilo José Cela or Torrente Ballester. All these people were creating culture from within Spain, weren't they?
Yes.
So how can you?
Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we have an entire seminar session of several days about this? No, you're quite right. It's a provocative theme. It's an interesting theme. It's a theme which offers, at least as I write it in the book, no solutions of any sort. And it opens itself wide to criticism in specific cases. One case I'll deal with is the names you have written. It's interesting that where Spain has clung more to self-production and the capacity for self-production is in the written word. In many other respects of artistic creativity, their creativity comes from abroad. And I refer that specifically to the areas of art, that is to say, art through color, and music, the two areas where Spanish creativity is at its richest outside the country rather than inside the country. That's one point which we can debate infinitely. But the other point is one of the persons I noted as being an exile and creative, and he did it all outside Spain, but whom the Spaniards, if you read a book about him, they almost never mention that he didn't live in Spain. That is Ignatius Loyola. Ignatius Loyola spent some time in Spain. He's studying in Spain and so on and so forth. Twice he was arrested by the Inquisition for stupidities, which he refused to admit as being legitimate. He left Spain and he never went back to Spain. All his creative work, the writing of his creative literature, the Jesuit order which he founded, which was very largely Spanish in composition in its early years, all the theology, the art and so on of the Order of Jesus is all created outside Spain, insofar as St. Ignatius is responsible for it. But he is an exile. He is not Spanish. His outlook is not Spanish. His spirituality is not Spanish. His spirituality is Northern European and French. So that's another example, which again is open. It's an open argument. But still on Ignatius Loyola, let me remind you that the only religious order ever expelled physically to the last man from Spanish territory is the Jesuit order. it was the revenge of the Spanish people against Saint Ignatius to expel all his sons totally from Spain. And they lived, I forget how many years outside the country, 60 years, 70 years,
like that, yeah.
a long time. They were not allowed to come back to Spain. But Saint Ignatius, for those of you who might be interested nowadays, people don't read Saint Ignatius a lot. But I find his example very interesting.
Right. Now, another of your most recent and controversial subjects has been Catalonia. Obviously, as someone who enjoys dispelling myths so much and living in Barcelona, tell us about the thesis that you defend in this last major work. It was published in Spain under the title of España y Cataluña, Historia de una Pasión,
it's not
2 years ago.
It's not being published in English. It's España y Cataluña, Historia de una Pasión. Okay. Luckily we're speaking English, otherwise I'd be expelled from Catalonia if I did this. It centers around one thing. It centers around my book on Philip V and about a place just outside the center of Barcelona called the Born, El Borne in Castilian, the Born, which used to be a medieval market, and which was part of the city of Barcelona, completely leveled, all the houses were emptied, to create the fortaleza of, what's it called? The Ciutadella, yes, the Ciutadella of Barcelona. It was the fortress of occupation of Barcelona under Philip V. So, when they discovered, they were cleaning up some ruins, they discovered a little bit of stone there, and then they discovered more stones, and then they discovered streets. And they suddenly decided this would suit us very well to resurrect this entire area as proof of the destructive capacity of Spanish power over the Catalan people. And they now have there a big underground area which has been excavated, and a big ceiling over it, and is treated as a sacred area. But when they tried to come to justify what it meant, how it happened, what were the real facts about it, they avoided contact with any historians who knew anything about the subject. They recruited 3 journalists who were nationalist-oriented, or at least were paid by the nationalist party, to write publicity and to write up the history of the Born. Since then, the present government in Catalonia has excluded historians completely from any overview of the history of their country. And they've left the rewriting of their country entirely in the hands of paid journalists, and their works you can buy in the street everywhere in Barcelona. But not a single Catalan historian, I'm talking about Catalan historians, people who are Catalans and who write in Catalan, not a single one of them has been employed by the Generalitat. So here we have a problem in which, on the basis of a myth, which is that the Castilians, the Spaniards, destroyed Barcelona, massacred its people, and this is the symbol of it. This looks like a tomb of the dead outside Barcelona. On the basis of that, they've tried to build up a myth about what it signifies. Mm-hmm. So as a result of that, in at least 2 chapters of my book, I give footnotes to try to explain that what every historian of Catalonia knows, namely that Catalonia was not the rebellion against Philip V in the 18th century was not of the Catalans against. It was a rebellion of one part of Catalonia and of one part of the city of Barcelona against the other part of Catalonia and the other part of the city of Barcelona. In other words, it was a conflict between Catalans. But that you are not allowed to say in the press at the moment. That is forbidden because it is not accepted. So we are in a strange situation now, which I must say is sad because it is the only part of Europe I know of where the government is deliberately falsifying the history of their own country and forbidding their own historians from writing about it, because they want this picture to be accepted internationally.
How can an advanced civil society like the Catalanese that takes pride on the so-called CENI, the common sense, have a political elite that ends up advocating independence based on myths or unrealistic aims? How can you explain this?
Well, no, that's fairly easy. Thank you. At last, an easy question. I'm not talking about independence, because independence is something I myself sometimes support. I don't support. Anybody has a right to look for independence, but it's the basis on which you claim independence, which is what you've just mentioned. Now, all independence movements create their own myths and they invent their own histories. That is particularly true of all the countries which have emerged from post-Titoite Yugoslavia. They have all created their own history and their own myths. And all of us, when we want to try and insist that we have an identity and a character, we invent untruths about the past. And if I can quote people who have done this very famously, the English, who are foremost in having created myths about where they came from, what they did, and so on and so forth. The Spaniards also, but that's another thing. But Catalonia, yes.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Catalonia, I believe, may be justified in wanting its independence, but it's basing that claim on, as you say, totally absurd pretensions and complete untruths as far as the real facts and the historical situation goes.
This leads us to another subject that you've dealt with in some of your books, the concept of Spain as a nation. Now, the concept of Spain as a nation is older than that of most great nations in Europe. Its present frontiers are consolidated in 1512, which is quite extraordinary, and the modern state makes progress from the times of Philip V, as you explain in your books. Yet, on the other hand, we find contemporary Spain still debating whether it's one nation, a nation of nations, or a nation that has another nation within it. How can you explain this paradox? What has failed in this process of consolidation of a nation?
Dare I suggest the Spaniards? Mm-hmm. No, it's a defect. It's a defect. It's a weakness. Mm. It's a weakness of the way in which the totality of Spain has evolved. It's a weakness. The explanations for that weakness are varied, and Spaniards themselves have published so much on it that I dare not open my mouth about it. They've published a lot about it. So you know as well as I what the weaknesses are in the evolution of Spain. So we are faced with these two contradictory statements, that there is an entity called Spain or Hispania or España, which can go back a long way. But even today, in this year, in this day, when leading Spaniards and intelligent Spaniards say, we do not exist, we are not a country, then something has gone wrong somewhere.
You wouldn't know. You wouldn't be able to say what's gone wrong.
I am no more equipped than you are to opine about it. All I am equipped to is not to deal with that global question, because that's a very unkind global question. But if it were a much smaller question, like saying, did Spain really exist in 1500? Well, the fact is, of course, it didn't. The word España existed, but it was still consisted of 2 or 3 different independent countries, totally independent within themselves. And so España as a country did not come into existence until Philip V, and even then it did not come into existence. Because even with Philip V, there were parts of Spain which were totally independent. The Basques were still an independent country. Navarra was still an independent country. And so on and so forth. So part of the problem is some defects in the way the pizza has been put together. And the dressing on top looks very rich, like a Pizza Hut pizza, but underneath it is defective.
Right. Okay, just to finish off with your historian's idea on what's on the moment Spain is living now. Obviously, as throughout your career, you've seen, you've witnessed the spectacular changes that contemporary Spain has lived through. Probably to the extent that it's been described as the most prosperous time Spain has ever had. And yet we find ourselves now with a country that's still struggling with a very serious economic crisis, a Catalan government that has officially opened a process of independence, and a political elite incapable of forming government. Isn't this one of the greatest crises Spain has suffered in your lifetime, or with your historical perspective? In the last in modern times,
it's difficult to condemn at all, because if you have I'm 2 or 3 years older than he is, so my memory goes back further. I can remember, for example, going to work in the archives in the Ciudad Universitaria. I used to live in the Casa de Velázquez first, and I remember several occasions seeing the desfile of the Moorish guard of Franco, with Franco riding on his horse down through the university area. I remember that, and that was another era. I remember also being invited to give a lecture at the University of Barcelona by my friend José Antonio Maraval, who was going to be Minister of Education, and I got into the taxi and he took me to the university, and he wasn't paying any attention to me, the taxi driver. He was listening to the radio. And I said, you should be going that way. And so he said, don't worry. He said, tonight we have started the Civil War. And he said, can't you hear it? And you could, from where we were in the taxi, we could hear the bombs. We could hear the bombs. And the next day, I walked down the main street of the Castellana in Barcelona, and there were tanks which had cut the Castellana off.
Madrid.
Madrid.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Tanks which had cut. Tanks which had cut the streets off, and the police were keeping people away. And so I've lived through moments in Spain's history. But nothing surprises me, because I get the impression that despite everything, Spain has not moved forward at the same velocity, at the same speed as other countries. For example, and I can tell you this openly now, because they have about 300 people waiting trial in Spain at the moment for this. We have always known, those who have lived in Spain, that corruption in the bureaucracy was a basic aspect in the administrative bureaucracy, was a basic aspect of the way things were done. That is to say, you paid money for permissions for buildings to be done, you paid money for houses to be built, and so on and so forth. But this everybody accepted. In Catalonia, for example, it was accepted. Where I lived and bought a house, it was all accepted. So when you go back to England and find that this doesn't exist, it's completely unknown in England on any scale that you can imagine, and to find that it was perfectly accepted at every level in the Catalan administration, in the villages and the towns, you got the feeling that this is another country, and it should have progressed beyond this stage. So I can't comment on your question, because I believe that Spain has not made, over these years of great progress, the sufficient progress towards the same degree of political and social behavior as certain other countries, such as France or England.
Right. Mm-hmm. Very well. Okay, before we still have, I think I'll just open the floor for a couple of questions. Then I'll finish off with the three questions I always ask, which require very short answers. So now let's open the floor for questions or comments. Any questions or comments from the audience? Give them a couple of... Yes, the lady at the back.
Thank you. My name is Celia Robbins, and I studied Spanish at, Hispanic Studies at Edinburgh, and I also studied at the University of Barcelona in 1965, when you were taught in Spanish, and had a fantastic medieval historian. I don't live in Spain now, but I did for 10 years. During the Franco and after that period in the Transición. You've exploded so many myths for me tonight. There are things I would take issue with and would love to discuss further. But what I wanted to ask you was really about how... Having started down this route of getting interested in Spain, is that what's led you to continue your academic work mainly in that area, or have there been other reasons?
Very briefly, my academic work actually is not really concerned with Spain as such. Okay. I've written several books on European history, and also, as the director knows well, the high proportion of my books, such as The Disinherited, for example, are based squarely on a European perspective. In other words, I always try and keep in mind the European experience, not just a purely Hispanic experience, because basing yourself, studying only one country, never gives you the perspective to try and make comparisons. And comparisons must always be made, because we all, share the same planet. The second point...
Well, I've got another very quick question,
okay,
if I
fine.
may. Is when you were talking about Spain not conquering parts of the empire, I thought, what about Mexico?
Yeah. No, I know.
Did they not conquer Mexico? There are books called La Conquista de Mexico.
I know, yes. What else? Wishful thinking. Let's see. Let me put it like this. No scholar of Mexican history now, whichever country they come from, and I mean mainly Mexico and the United States, which is where most of the experts are from, would accept the notion of conquista. Conquista in the sense of valiant conquistadors going in and beating up people and taking over their country. Forget about it. The key event in the fall of Tenochtitlan in Mexico was the fall of the city of Tenochtitlan, where, if my memory serves me right, 900 Spaniards overthrew a city of 500,000 people. Superbly armed city, beautiful defenses, 900 Spaniards. But of course that figure is wrong, because it's untrue. The 900 Spaniards were helped by the figures of the experts, not the experts, because they're basically figures given by the Indian historians of Mexico of that time. Something like 300,000 Indians surrounded Mexico with Cortés, massacred. Cortés himself describes in his letters to the emperor, I tried to stop the massacres, but I couldn't. It was terrible how these people are killing each other. The Spaniards weren't responsible for the overthrow of Mexico. The Indians were. And all the experts will agree on that. There's no problem. So the problem here is simply the use of the word conquista. Yes, use the word conquista, the conquest, because it's a very simple way of explaining the event. But what really happened in the conquest, that's what one really needs to look at. And what happens in the conquest is very, very complex. Lots of books have been written about them, mainly by, as I say, American historians from the New World and United States. All excellent studies, and they all point to the same conclusion, that the story of conquistadors is a fairy story. In fact, I deliberately do not use the word conquistador in my books, not to encourage this way of thinking of people as being, valiant soldiers. Nothing of that sort happened.
Thank you.
Hi, I would like to ask you for the metaphor you made about the pizza in Spain, just because I understand the point you make, but for example, couldn't you compare the pizza, like very nice on the top and destroyed in the base or at the bottom? Like, for example, in Britain happened the same. So you have Wales, you have Ireland, you have Scotland, even though the accents are very different between each other. Like basically language, you have the York accent, you have the Cockney. I don't know as much, but in thinking about Spain, it's true that we have like different language. For example, like the Canary Islands are very far from the peninsula. Also, like the Baleares, like the Isla Baleares are very far. But I think I agree. Like Spain is very it's not very unified nowadays. But for example, if you put together people, for example, from Galicia and Andalusia, they are still Spanish. They speak Spanish as well, and they can get with each other. Like my point is basically, you could say the same about the not being so different in Spain. You could say the same in Britain right now, like with the referendum and stuff. For example, Welsh people, they consider themselves Welsh. They are no English, obviously, but they are British. As for example,
no, okay.
Do you understand my point?
I agree completely with you. Yeah, no, I agree completely with you. I thought you were going to ask about language, but we'll forget about that. What you were speaking about at the end, I completely agree with. Yes, it's a problem. It's a problem which is now coming to the surface in Great Britain. Shall I call it Great Britain or the United Kingdom? It's a problem which is coming to the surface now, and the reasons for it, obviously, the British would have their own explanation. The explanation in Spain. Well, as I said, I wasn't offering an explanation. I was just commenting that the impression I get is that Spain never really came together. And that at the top it appeared to be together. That's why I said the topping on the pizza. But underneath it was never together. With the British, it's somewhat different, I think. Because, por mis pecados, I'm also British as well, you see. So I can also see the British problem, and I'm puzzled by the British thing as well. But with the British, there's one new factor which the Spaniards have not yet had to a very great degree: immigration of people from non-Christian cultures. I say specifically non-Christian cultures. In Spain, in theory, everybody was Christian. After they threw everybody out, after they threw all the Muslims and Jews out. But in the United Kingdom, there's a very large non-English cultural minority, and that is causing problems, or provoking other problems, shall we put it like that. It's very complex, but thank you for the question.
Hi, I'm Liberty, and I'm a 17-year-old A-level student. And I've only been studying Spanish for a few years, but I'm interested in studying at university, and I'm not well versed in Spanish history. So, where would you advise to start?
In what area?
Spanish history. Sorry, did I speak too fast? Yeah.
I know. Where are you resident?
I'm at Norbury Manor right now. It's a school in Croydon. No, I'm an A-level student, and I'm interested in studying Spanish at university. And I'm interested in. I'm not well versed in history, so I just wanted your advice on where to start.
Well, no. Anything I say is going to be incorrect, because a lot depends. For example, you can learn all about Spanish history without ever going to university. So, it's not necessary to go to university and study Spanish history. And sometimes it's worse going to university because from what I've been told by some students, their teachers are terrible. Not just in Spanish history, in any history on any. So so that's why I say my answer is incorrect. Whatever I say, no. First of all, educate yourself by reading interesting things. Then by finding an institution which will give you money to study, which is very important. And then the rest will take care of itself.
Okay.
Very well. Let me finish off with 3 questions I always ask at the end that require a very short answer. 1 sentence or 1 word or 1 sentence at the most.
One word.
The most enduring legacy of the Spanish Empire. 1 sentence at the most.
Okay. The enduring legacy of all empires is exactly the same. Their language. The English gave India English. The Spaniards gave Argentina Spanish. So the enduring legacy is the language.
Is the
nothing
language.
else.
Right. And in your view, what is the most important contribution that Spain has made to world history?
World is an unfair question because it depends on what context. But let me pick out one thing which you already said was mythical, the concept of coexistence, convivencia. Because I think convivencia has a useful history, and it probably existed at some period in the Middle Ages. So maybe convivencia, if you'll allow me to. He doesn't like the answer, but...
I do like it. It's up to you, really.
He's got it.
And finally, the 3 most important historical figures of the Spanish-speaking world, according to you. This is easy for you.
Okay, no. It just occurred to me.
Having written so many biographies, I'm sure you can.
I'll try and make it easier because we are here in the Instituto Cervantes in London, and so 3 people who broadened the Spanish horizon by their experience in England.
Okay.
Of importance for Spanish history because of what they did in England. First of all, Philip II, King of England. He was King of England for almost 3 years. And he was a good King of England because he did nothing. No, it was very good because the English were burning each other at the time. And
okay, that's wrong.
No. Philip II.
Philip II. Okay.
In one of his chats which occurs in my book, he was speaking to one of his ministers. He said, "We need a police force in this country to look after the people in the streets and keep the peace in the villages." I saw that in practice in London when I was there, and they have a very good police force in London. The king said that. I don't know if he ever put it into practice. Okay, the next one. The next one with the connection in oh yes, a king. Okay, a king is.
No, it's up to you. It doesn't have to be a king.
Okay,
3
let's have
most important historical figures. You've mentioned one. So
let's have a very important historical figure. Isaac Albéniz.
Okay.
One of the great musicians of Spain. His best compositions were written. All his compositions obviously are based on the Spanish tradition. In London, in England, Albéniz is an Englishman. He did the presentation of his work in England. He was supported by English money, and he worked in England. It's the place he most loved for writing music. He took all that back with him to Spain, obviously, but he learned it in England in the same way as the director here will take back to Spain his experience of England. The third person, Ah, yes, okay. Another area, very, very important, science. Severo Ochoa, again, is an exception because he has helped to contribute to science even though he was a Spaniard. But his most creative years before he did his real research in New York, his most creative years were in England. He spent over 2 years, probably slightly more, I forget the exact time, in England doing his initial research work. Not in Spain, because they wouldn't give him any center. Indeed, my wife and I were with Ochoa in the same room after Ochoa retired and he went back to Spain to live. And you know, they took him back to Spain because he was famous and they wouldn't give him a job.
Yeah.
Because they said, etc. No. And
sounds familiar, yes.
People actually wrote a memoir among themselves saying, we do not want emigrados here to take our jobs from us. Now, so these are people who had contact with the English world, with England. Severo Ochoa, Isaac Albéniz, and His Majesty Philip II, King of England.
Very well. Well, on this tone, I think we will leave it here. Professor Kamen, it's been a great pleasure to have you here with all these thought-provoking comments, and we can now continue upstairs over a glass of wine. Thank you very much.